Hi, so welcome to the next video in this series that we have around making it your own when it comes to .b. And just wanted to say hi again to Richard, who's been joining.
Hello, hi Faiy, good to be back.
Yeah, lovely to have you here. And we also have as a special guest on this video, Michelle Harris, who works in a school in London and works specifically with Key Stage 3. Is that right, Michelle?
Yes, that's right. Hello, really nice to be here. Thank you.
So we're talking about lesson 5 of .b. I'm sure that we've all got different ways of delivering this, but it'd be really interesting to hear, Michelle, how you approach this. Has it been the same since the beginning when you first started teaching? Has it changed?
Yep, so I teach normally year 7, 8 when I'm doing the .b curriculum. And funny enough, I remember the first days of teaching this in my early years, getting them to move around in the studio mindfully felt a bit chaotic, and then I felt like I had to rein it in. So maybe I was a bit more controlled in how I set things up and how I wanted them to move. But now, as I'm exploring that lesson, I feel like I'm going full circle and going back to allowing them to explore a bit more freely in the studio. So in our school, we have lots of students who have conditions like ADHD, and they're moving all the time, and that's just their natural way of being, and trying to work with that rather than trying to make that wrong or make them feel like they're wrestling against something when we're practicing. So I've been tapping into maybe working with, allowing that, playing with that, getting them to maybe move in different ways, and then bringing them quietly down to noticing a little bit more. Okay, can you feel that pressure in your feet? Can we slow things down? So there's this contrast between they were in the studio, they were moving around in maybe their normal way, and then bringing them down to noticing and being more aware of sensations of walking and exploring that way. So that's sort of how I've been playing things recently. And I guess it's just something to mention, I was a professional dancer and head of dance in my school. So for me, movement has been second nature to me for many, many years, but not assuming that students are also going to feel movement in the same way as I would. So I'm always trying to be curious about, okay, this is how it feels for me. What's the way in for them in terms of how they feel and how they're sensing movement? Can they even sense, the motion in their bodies? So that's what I'm playing with at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks for sharing that, Michelle. How about you then, Richard? Because I know you've got older young people that you work with.
Yeah, I've got older children, sort of mostly year 10 I do this with. And actually listening to Michelle talking there, it's interesting because I think you do end up working with what you're comfortable with. And I'm not a professional dancer. And so actually, I think my confidence has grown and changed in different ways over the years. What I used to do a lot of was the kind of traditional samurai walking or the zombie walking, where you slow them right down. And I would even do slow races between them, which I know we're not supposed to use competitions, but in many respects, it really focused their mind on the way they were moving, crossing all in a line, crossing from this side of the kind of exam hall or large space to the other side as slowly as you can, but you've always got to keep moving. And if I see that you stop, then you go back to the beginning. And that's actually worked really well. And then they can do that with their teenagers. They can only maintain that containedness for a while. So then I get them to speed up and speed up and speed up and go really a bit crazy and moving around. Then I say, when I clap, just freeze. And then they froze. And that was when I then get them walking as quickly as they could. And then at the end of that, stopping them again and asking them to make themselves as large as they possibly could and then as small as they possibly could. And again, that kind of works with your expertise in the sense that I'm not a yoga practitioner at any level that could feel confident teaching. And yet the idea of making your body large and making your body small is something I'm comfortable with. And it was very sweet the way they would just curl up into these tiny little balls, and it would also quieten them down. So all of that was working quite well, but I did find that I found that it was a lesson I was always nervous about because it was always slightly chaotic at the beginning, or there'd be some who wouldn't play ball. And I found it quite hard to feel confident that it would always work. And then and then it was partly dependent on the weather. So I've actually settled on a formula which I find works really well, which is I keep the lesson kind of as it is, where they do standing practice at the beginning, and I challenge them to stand completely still, and they realize that you can't. Even when you're completely still, when your eyes are closed, you can feel those tiny, tiny little movements in the legs which are keeping you upright, even though you're not making any choices. And then we talk about flow. They love sport, a lot of them. We talk about sport. I show them Last Samurai, which they always enjoy. And then I say, right, the challenge is, can you walk for 5 minutes around the school in no mind? In other words, with your senses completely engaged. And every time you notice yourself chattering to yourself, just come back to seeing the clouds, seeing the buildings, seeing the people around you, etc. And that's actually worked really well. And I've got 4 maps of the kind of school campus type area. And again, I think a lot of this is determined by what spaces you're working in. And I'm lucky enough to work in a big enough space where I can set them off on different little walking routes. Right, you're A, you're B, you're C, you're D. You go out of the door, turn left. You go out of the door, turn right. You go out of the other door, turn left. And they just do 5 minutes walking around on their own, and then they come back. And when they come back, I say, what did you notice? And actually, it's really quite moving, because it's almost like they haven't ever really looked up at their surroundings in that way, because they've always been so involved in each other and their social lives, that it's actually really nice. And then the last thing to say about that is it's always quite fun, because I learned that I had to give them a warning, which is if a member of staff sees you walking around on your own, because they were being challenged, like, what are you doing? Why are you out of lessons now? That kind of brought humor into it as well, which lightened it slightly.
Really interesting, because I can really hear, listening to both of you and your experiences, that you work in different contexts and with different ages. And actually, that both those ages you've got to have a different way of doing it with them, because I'd imagine, Michelle, that you can't have year 7 walking off on their own around the school campus. Perhaps, I don't know how big your school campus is, but obviously with older children you're more able to trust them, perhaps, and you've got that established relationship, and so you can do that. And I was thinking, when you were saying about, Richard, about kind of them doing the slow sort of walking, it made me think about the fact that I had one group that they'd put us into a dance studio to do the walking practice, and there was no way of closing the curtains over the mirrors in that room on that particular day, and all of them were doing their walking, but it was like, Ministry of Silly Walks and faces going as well, and in the end I was just like, I'm not going to try and contain this and make make this kind of like some sort of, Thich Nhat Hanh. So I just went with it and went with the fact that they were doing all of that.
Which reminds me, actually, Faiy, I should pay tribute to another sort of co-writer of Dot B, Chris O'Neill, who had a lot of the humour in Dot B came from Chris. And he used to do something very similar, but deliberately made the children, or invited the children. He was quite unorthodox in many ways, Chris, to walk literally in the middle of the school. There was like a quad or like an open area in the middle of the school, which was overlooked by loads of the classrooms. And he would do the samurai walking in that space. And he would say, look, you're going to feel really self-conscious. People are going to be looking out and saying, what are they doing? What are those guys doing? He said, just notice how that feels. Notice what that is. And just see if you can befriend that and roll with it. I think I'd be maybe too self-conscious myself. But he did it, and I think maybe that's the other thing. You've got to feel confident with what you're doing. It's lovely hearing Michelle talk about dance, because she's so confident in that. And I probably wouldn't have felt as confident as Chris doing the way he did it. So you've got to be at ease yourself with whatever you're teaching or inviting them to do or guiding them to do, so that you continue to be authentic to them, because they smell, they've got great BS radars, as we like to say.
I was just thinking as you're talking that I'm so curious, even after all the years I've been teaching dance and doing lots of different movement practices, actually, but I really love exploring how things feel, that sort of sensation and how it feels in the body. And you were talking about the slow race, and I know that I've also, with the students, got them to go from standing all the way down to the floor as slowly as they could. So it's another sort of idea of not to be competitive, but can you just notice what it's like to go as slowly as you can, and noticing how the body feels. And that's a lot of fun often for them as well. So just different ways again of playing with movement and getting them to explore how their body might move and feel that sensation. Yeah.
And there's something, isn't there, about, you were saying about how to help them access sensation, because it might not be easy for them? I know you had a story, didn't you, of a student that you were doing a little bit of work with.
Yeah, so we were doing some mindful walking, and I was trying to explain to him about, this samurai walking. Can you feel the sensations in your feet? And he was very much like, no, no, no. Everything I said, suggested, really didn't want to focus his mind. And I noticed that he had his hands in his pockets. And so I said, well, can you feel your hands in your pockets and sensations on the material? And that sort of brought him to a standstill, and I could see his eyes moving and he was thinking. And then he was said, oh yes, I can feel that. And for me, that was a way in. And then I was able to continue walking with him and just sort of explore where if you could feel the sensation of your hands, then maybe you can then feel other parts of, material and other parts of the body. And then he was able to take that with him as he was walking with me. So I guess it's just as we're making it our own, thinking about how is it for these students, what's the way in for them, which does take a little bit of time. And if you've got a lot of students, it's not always easy to do that. But I'm really loving that actually. And I find it builds even bigger connections with the students that you're teaching because you're
Mm.
switching into to them and to their world.
And it is also, it does depend so much on the context of where you are and what spaces you can use. Because I'm conscious that some people won't be able to use a dance studio or a big space. I know that actually the reason my lesson works at the moment is because I'm in a building where there are two exits that you can go one door, the other door. If I was on the far corner of the campus, it'd actually be much harder because I couldn't get them to leave the room without being only 5 feet away from each other. And then that lesson probably wouldn't work. And then I'd probably have to adapt it. So I think you're always working with the constraints of your space, but in a sense, it's out of those constraints that often the creativity can come.
Yeah. I can remember during COVID and the students had to all be in their classrooms. And during that lesson, we had this area where we had tables just outside where students often sit and would eat. And so we went outside and did it then. And so they've got these tables, these rows, but there were gaps. And so they were sort of more guided in terms of their pathway. But we worked within that space.
That reminds me of another one, Michelle, when you said the space between them, because there was one day when I was teaching in the summer and we were, again, lucky enough to have a couple of football pitches. And I took them down to the football pitches and they were just wearing their white shirts, black trousers. And it was a lovely day, so they could take their shoes and their socks off. And it was really poetic because I just said, move around these two pitches, but you've always got to stay in your own little bubble and try and stay away from other people so that you're all equidistant from each other. And it was this lovely vision of these, 25 kids or so, just all spaced out, moving very quietly in this space. And then just at that moment, somebody who's one of the school's sort of more athletic people, one of the teachers who I guess was more of an athlete and was actually quite skeptical about Dot B in the beginning, he was wearing his running kit and just piled right through the middle of these two pitches and these groups. And there was this wonderful contrast of kind of one form of mindful movement, if you like, the speed, the running, the athleticism, going like an arrow right through all these very slow, gentle bodies moving around. And I'm not saying either of them is better or worse, but the contrast was really striking and very memorable.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. It sort of makes me think about how, of course, mindful awareness in sport is a really key thing in terms of bringing attention to what's happening and what you're doing. And of course, for us as teachers is how can we communicate that as well? That it's being mindfully aware of any movement that we're doing, which is what we're exploring here, as opposed to necessarily needing to be slower. Though, of course, slowing it down can just help with that tuning in to sensation, as you were saying before, Michelle, about how we help them access sensation and noticing. But actually, variety is quite lovely, isn't it, to really play with that, like you were saying as well in your lesson, Richard, about like the real speeding up of everything too. I'm just going to share a story that's just come to mind actually, because sometimes I think when you think about this lesson compared to say the other lessons that are about worry or about how we work with the mind and things like that, we don't necessarily think about this lesson as being a lesson that has that kind of penny dropping for some students. I don't anyway, so I'm just going to say that from my perspective. But I just wanted to share that I had one group that I taught this to, that was one of my wellbeing groups. This was in the main secondary school that I did a lot of this teaching. And I had one young girl who was in that group who used to struggle with anxiety when having to move around the rest of the school with the rest of the school community. And she used to have a pass, actually, so she could come later into lessons and leave early and things like that, so that she didn't have all of those bodies around her, because we all know how congested schools can be in the corridor. Anyway, after we did this lesson, the following lesson, when we came to lesson 6, I was asking everybody about what they'd experienced when they were having a little go at walking on their own. And she shared that she'd been able to walk the corridors with other students for the first time since she'd been in that school, and she'd been in the school for 3 years. And it was because she was tuning into the sensations in her body. And so she wasn't getting caught up in thinking about everybody else and their proximity to her. And actually, she spoke at an event about the fact that this has absolutely transformed her experience of school life, because she was able to do mindful walking as opposed to how it had been for her, which was just very anxiety inducing. So
Yeah. It's a really lovely story, Faiy. Actually, taking it into their real lives, that's actually a really good point. There is actually a little practice right at the end of the lesson where we invite them to sort of name, I'm pretty sure this is in the teaching booklet, we ask them to name one stretch that they walk every day that they could try and do in a mindful way. So for the kids, we actually let them walk to the train station, and there's shops, and I might say from the Starbucks to the McDonald's, there might be, I don't know, like 6 or so shops, and see if you can just remember when you see that Starbucks logo or the golden arches, that's your trigger to actually just walk and just look up. And I don't know how many of them do that, but it'd be lovely to think that some of them are taking it out into the world with them.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, when you mentioned that, one thing that tends to come up almost every lesson, I'll have one student say to me after doing the stretch exercise near the beginning that they didn't realise how tired their body felt. And just, yeah, that tuning in and understanding, if this is here, maybe I could maybe take care of this, or just having that bigger awareness.
Yeah.
Something that's happening in their body.
So it almost being like a prompt for self-care.
Yeah.
Especially if you're quite used to moving around quite quickly, and then something you've stopped and realised, actually, I'm really quite tired. That's quite a big contrast of what might be going on.
I noticed that so much. The day I had an older class, year 13, and it was a small class, like a supervised study type situation, and there were like 12 of them who for various reasons weren't in other classes. And we just did a FOF-bop, and honestly, their heads just went down on the desks like dominoes, and they were knackered. And afterwards, I don't expect much from inquiry in the classroom, and got lots of guidelines about how to do and how not to do inquiry in the classroom. But I just said, "What did you notice?" And this kid just said, "God, I said I needed that." And that was so lovely to hear someone say that. It felt right for their bodies. We talk about movement, for their bodies just to crumple onto the desk and for them to sleep. It's just what their bodies needed at that time.
It's that listening to the body.
And great opportunities then for, in that action step that we know is there as part of a 3-part breathing space of just, how do I take care of myself in the next moments of my day? That's what we're inviting, aren't we? And that all of that tuning in is that knowing how we are, and then choosing what feels right for us. And it might be more rest, and it might be going and having a good old run around the place. Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your experiences. It's really...
Thank you, Michelle. It's been really lovely to have you here with us.
Great to talk to you both.
Thank you.